This is episode 1 of Podcast Local from On The Go FM. I'm Jason Norris, and I'm here to talk about local podcasting. In future episodes, I'll also be talking with local podcasters. We learn in community, and we learn by observing others. And the local podcasters I've met have already taught me. But coming up on this first episode, I want to define local, so we're all on the same page. And I'll share the influence the local podcast community has had on my thinking. And I'll share what I believe is the heart of local podcasting. You can actually consider it kind of a benchmark or a guideline to measure your success in this kind of podcasting. And I have a free resource for you, which I'll talk about at the end of the episode. Support for Podcast Local comes from the Satchel Podcast Player for Android and iPhone. Satchel makes it easy to discover podcasts produced in your hometown. Learn more at satchelplayer.com. Early this year, I was invited by Ray Ortega to be on the Podcasters Roundtable. The topic of the night was the challenge of being local. And I'll link to that episode in the show notes for this episode of Podcast Local. One of the questions that came up was, what is local? And it's an important question. If you decide to create a local podcast, you'll need to determine the borders of your show. Now, since that time, I've been focusing my own definition of local. And this summer, I had a chance to write an article for Poddertainment magazine, and in that article, I shared my 3-part definition. And then I started talking with other local podcasters, and I realized I need to modify my definition again. So now it's a 2-part definition of local with a third bonus part that is not required, but it can make a local podcast an agent of change in your community. So here's how I define a local podcast, at least as of October 10th, 2016. First and foremost, it's a geographic niche. It's primarily focused on a specific area, which could be your state, your city, a region, county, parish, or neighborhood. Even podcasts created by local churches for their congregations, or podcasts about local sports teams could fit into this category. Next, your community is your content. You have to podcast, of course, from some location. But if your location has nothing to do with your show, then that's not a local podcast. If you're living in Seattle, but you only talk about Apple products, that's not a local show. What you talk about has to be related in some way to your community. So a local podcast is focused on a geographic niche, and the people, places, and things in your community are what you podcast about. Now, this third part is also important, but I now realize it doesn't apply to everyone. Consider it, though. As I said, your community is your content, and your community is your audience. The show is about your community, and it's for your community. This makes it distinct from, say, a tourist podcast, where the primary audience is for people who don't live there. In my original definition, which I am modifying, a local podcast is a show that tells the stories of your community to your community. And to me, this is what makes local podcasting important. Most people won't hear the stories about your community, unless, of course, something bad happens and national news crews fly in to report all about it. But you can tell the stories that matter to your community. You can create connections and help build up your community through podcasting. I think my wife said it well in an article that she wrote for the Fort Worth Moms blog when we were living in Fort Worth. She said, "We want to pour back into the community and invest in the city. We want it to be a better place because we chose to stay here and raise our daughters here." Now, that's the lofty goal I have in creating a local podcast for my community. And I know it's something that will take time. So in the meantime, I think the best advice is just to start. Explore your community, discover interesting things, visit places with your portable recorder, talk to people. Tell the stories of your community. And that's what I want to talk about next. Stories. Podcast Local is about stories. And I want to take a little closer look at that. But first, I want to tell you about something that can help your local podcast get discovered. If you're a podcaster, take out the podcaster earbuds, so to speak, right now, and put in the podcast listener earbuds. As a listener, you get curious, let's say, that you wonder if there's a local podcast about your community. If there is one, how would you go about finding it? And if a local podcast got a little too creative with their name and didn't include the community name in the title, then you might have a hard time finding them. So, one way to discover podcasts near you is to use the Satchel Podcast Player. It's the world's first podcast player that can show you both locally focused and locally sourced podcasts right in your hometown. When you open the app, you'll find categories that'll help you find some show that you're interested in. But one of the big categories there is local. Click that, and it searches for shows in your area. Okay, now put your podcaster earbuds back in again. You can register your own show with them, so podcast listeners are able to discover your podcast when they search their local area. The Satchel Podcast Player is available on Android and iPhone, and you can learn all about it at satchelplayer.com. That's satchelplayer.com. All right, now I said that Podcast Local is about stories, and I want to go deeper here because I think this is vitally important. Your community is made up of people, places, interesting things. And every person, place, and interesting thing has a history. And history is story. Origin stories, stories of change, stories of great times, and stories of heartbreak, stories of love and war and peace and kindness. Stories of hopes and fears and dreams of the future. If you're looking for some benchmark or some guideline, something to indicate whether you're successful as a local podcaster, this is it. Forget money and downloads for a moment. How well do you tell the stories of your community? How good of a storyteller are you? The stories you tell will vary depending on the format and style of your local podcast, and there are different ways to tell stories. If your show is the interview format, then perhaps your guest is the storyteller. But as the podcaster, you guide the guest by the questions you ask and the conversation you have. You are telling the stories of your community when you talk to people in your community. If your show is the narrative format, then clearly that's a story. You're writing and talking about people, places, and things in your community. You are telling the stories of your community when you take the time to research and write a compelling narrative. And if your show is a narrative mixed with lots of in-the-moment recordings of ambient sound and conversations, then you're telling a complex story. You're creating an audio experience that can make the listener feel like it's what it's like to actually be there. It's a style, of course, you've heard in a few public radio shows, and it requires a lot of practice and often a lot of other people who can help you. But no matter how you format your show, you are telling the stories of your community. Telling stories well is the benchmark to look for. If you podcast local, you are a storyteller. Become a great storyteller. Now, as I wrap up this first episode, I want to share just a bit about the network that hosts Podcast Local. On the Go FM has been created to explore on-the-go learning with mobile technology. And of course, audio podcasts are one of the biggest and best uses of mobile technology, I believe. Right now, you can go to On the Go in Fort Worth. Now, this is a limited run series since my family has now moved to the other side of DFW Metroplex, but more on that in future episodes. Meanwhile, you can check out the episodes we did do while we were living in Fort Worth. There's also a meta podcast on that network. At the start of 2016, I decided as an experiment to podcast every day, and I eventually did that for 100 days. And there's a lot of good content in there. Okay, there's also some just so-so content in there too. But it was a great experience, exhausting, but I learned a lot from it. And you might get some ideas and inspiration in there too. And now there's Podcast Local. And I have created an on-the-go guide that features 7 ways you can tell the stories of your community. It's a handy PDF that you can either print out or save to your computer. No matter how you currently podcast local, I am sure there's at least one idea that might spark something new for you to pursue. If you'll come by the site and sign up for the onthego.fm update, our email newsletter, then I'll send you a link to the guide. And the easy way to remember for this show is just go to podcastlocal.com. That's podcastlocal.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I also look forward to hearing from you too. Tell me about your show. Tell me what you've learned and experienced. And feel free to ask questions too. I'm Jason Norris. Thanks for listening to episode 1 of Podcast Local from On the Go FM.